Getting new Skinwalker stories always does my heart some good, even though it's probably crying out in pain due to the stress of the terror brought on by Skinwalker stories. This one came in and really creeped me out. It takes place in Maine, of all places, and the title is extremely fitting. It seems like nowhere in the US is safe from its creepiest monster. This is titled, "There's Not Supposed to Be Skinwalkers in Maine," and was sent by a user called The Voice. Be careful what comes calling wanting to talk. Some things take a reply as the worst kind of invitation. I taught high school English for 31 years, which means I've read more student essays that open with a dictionary definition than any man should have to. And I always told my kids that starting that way was a crutch. So I'll only do it the once, and then I'll quit. That word is dooryard. It's a Maine word, or at least it's a word people still use up in that part of Maine, and it means the patch of bare ground right outside your door, before the grass starts, where you knock the mud off your boots, and your truck sits and the dog does its business. It's not the yard. It's the little in-between space that belongs to the house but is already outside of it. I didn't know that word until last fall. An old man named Wendell Hatch taught it to me, and by the time the season turned, I had reason to think about it more than I ever thought I would, more than any single word in my life. What I'm about to tell you, all of it is true, to the very best of my memory. I'm 61 now. I took early retirement a couple years ago, a little earlier than I had planned, because my marriage had ended and the house felt too big. The buyout I was offered was decent, and because somewhere in me was the idea that I'd had since I was about 20, which was that I was going to write a real book. Not a hobby. A book that an agent in New York would take on and publish. The kind of book reviewed in the back pages of a magazine. I'd written most of one in the years since my divorce. It was a long and serious novel about 3 generations of a family in a dying mill town in central Massachusetts, where I'm from, and I thought it was good. I still think parts of it were good. I'd gotten 2 agents to ask for the full manuscript over the previous winter, which anyone who has tried this will tell you is not nothing, and both of them had passed, kindly. I had convinced myself the problem was the ending, and the problem with the ending was that I'd written it in a house full of noise of my ordinary life. If I could get somewhere quiet and strange and far away, the right ending would come to me, eventually. That is how I ended up renting a camp outside Lebec, Maine, for the fall. If you don't know Lebec, it's the easternmost town in the United States. It sits way down east, out past where most people stop, on a finger of land that points at Canada. You can stand in Lebec and look across a narrow channel at Campobello Island, which is in New Brunswick, where Franklin Roosevelt had his summer place. There's a little iron bridge at the foot of Water Street that takes you across the border, if you've got your passport. 100 years ago, Lubec was the sardine canning capital of the world, with department stores and a movie theater and a working waterfront. And now most of that is gone. When the tide goes out, you can see the old cannery pilings sticking up out of the mud, like ribs of something. People still fish. There's the lighthouse everyone knows from the postcards, and the red and white candy-striped one out at the Quoddy Head, with a foghorn that goes 2 times every 30 seconds when the fog's in, which down there is most of the time. The woods come right down to the water, spruce and fir, dark and very close. The ground underneath them is soft, with 100 years of dropped needles and a green moss that swallows your footsteps. It is one of the most beautiful places I've ever been to, and I want that on the record too, because I'm about to make it sound like something else. I found the camp through an ad. It was an old fishing camp that a man named Wendell Hatch had winterized and rented out in the off months, out at the end of a dirt road I'm going to call the Bog Brook Road, which branches off the main road a few miles before you get to the lighthouse. It runs back toward the coast, through the trees, until it dead ends at a cove. The camp was the last place on the road. There was one other house about a half-mile back toward the main road, a summer place, empty and shuttered for the season by the time I got there at the end of September. Past my camp, there was nothing but the cove and the woods ran into the state parkland, hundreds of acres of it, and you could walk back into those trees as far as your legs would take you, and never come out anywhere. Wendell met me the day I moved in. He was somewhere in his 70s, and he'd fished his whole life and done carpentry and plowing in the winters. He still had a black dog, an old lab and something mixed named Mo, who had gone gray around the muzzle, and who took to me right away, in the indiscriminate way of old dogs. Wendell walked me through the camp, showed me how the wood stove drafted and where the breaker box was, and how the pump would lose its prime if I let the tank run too low. He was friendly, though dry. He showed me the dooryard and called it that, the dooryard, and I asked him immediately what that meant. He looked at me like I'd asked him to define a chair, and that's how I learned the word. There were two things he said that day that I didn't think about until much later. The first was about the cell signal. There wasn't any in the camp, not a bar of it. He told me that to make a call I'd have to go outside and stand in the dooryard. Or better yet, walk down toward the cove where there was a clear shot south, and even then it came and went. He said it apologetically, but I told him it was fine, that getting away from the phone was half the point, and he said that was the right attitude. Most people couldn't stand it. The second thing came when he was leaving. He was getting into his truck, and Mo was sitting in the dooryard between us. Wendell looked past me at the tree line where the cleared ground ended and the spruce started, a little ways from the back of the camp, and he said, not making a big thing of it, "I wouldn't go walking back in there after dark, if it was me." I said I wasn't much of a night hiker anyway. He nodded and smiled. Then he said the trails were fine in the daytime. Go anywhere you want in the daytime. But the woods down here turned around on you fast once the light went, and people got lost half a mile from their own kitchen. Then, he said, if you hear somebody calling to you out there at night, don't reply. Oh, it's nothing to worry about, you see. Sound carries strange on the water. You'll think it's close and it's actually a mile off, and you'll go toward it and turn an ankle in the dark. So be careful. Don't call back. He told me Mo could stay with me as much as I wanted, that he was good company, and Wendell's grandkids had stopped having time for him. He drove off down the Bog Brook Road then, and I stood in the dooryard with the dog, thinking about what a nice old man he was, and how good this whole deal was going to be for my book. The first 2 weeks were everything I'd wanted. I'd get up with the light, which seemed to come early there, and I'd make my coffee and ride at the kitchen table until the early afternoon, looking up at the cove and the fog, whenever there was fog. The riding went well, or at least it went, which after the previous spring felt like a miracle. In the afternoons, I'd go for walks. The state park gate closed for the season in the middle of October, but you could still park outside and walk the trails, and I did. Miles of them, out along the cliffs where the trail ran between the spruce and a drop down to the rocks, with Grand Manan a blue smudge across the water. Mo came with me. In the evenings, I'd cook something simple and read by the wood stove, and once a day I'd go for a walk down toward the cove with my phone held up, like an offering to the gods to let me call my daughter. My daughter's name is Rachel. She's 30, living in Portland, 3.5 hours south, and she works for a nonprofit. She worries about me constantly. She was no fan of this plan of mine. She thought of it as me trying to run away. She wasn't entirely wrong, but the calls between us were good. I'd stand down by the cove in the last of the light with the water going pink and tell her the riding was going well. Then she would tell me about her week. We'd say I love you and hang up. Now then, on to the strangeness. The first thing was so small, I'm almost embarrassed to write it. It was the dog. About 2 weeks in, Mo stopped wanting to go near the tree line at the back of the camp. He'd always trotted right up to it, nosing around the edge where the moss started. Then one evening, he simply wouldn't. I'd let him out the back door after supper, and he'd go part way across the cleared ground, then stop and stand stiff-legged, staring into the trees. And the fur would come up along his spine in a ridge. He'd make a low sound in his chest that wasn't quite a growl yet, more like a stern question. I'd call to him and he would come, but he'd come backward, watching those trees the whole way, and then he'd want inside. I thought there was a coyote out there, or a fisher or porcupine, something he could smell that I could not. I'd grown up around dogs. Dogs do get fixated on things. I latched the door and didn't think much of it. It was a few nights after that I heard the first one. I was at the table after dark, reading, the wood stove ticking. Mo was asleep at my feet. The window over the sink was a black square, and out of the woods, off to the back of the camp, came a sound that resembled the cry of a child. Not a scream, but a cry. The hitching, exhausted small child cry, where you can tell they've been crying a long time and have nearly given up. This went on for 10 or 15 seconds, then stopped. I sat very still. Mo had lifted his head up off the floor and was looking at the back wall of the camp in the direction of the trees, ears up, whole body tight. My honest first thought, was that I should go out there. A child was crying in the woods, and that is a thing you respond to before you finished thinking about it. I was halfway out of my chair, but then I remembered Wendell. Sound carries funny off the water. You'll think it's close, but it's actually a mile off. But I remembered. There was no house out that way. Nothing. Just the park. And also it was a 40-degree night, full darkness. No child was a mile back in those woods crying alone. The likeliest thing by far was an animal. Bobcat, I told myself. I'd read somewhere that a bobcat in the night can sound exactly like a person. And even a fox can scream and sound like a woman. I sat back down. The sound did not come again. I read the same paragraph 6 times and I went to bed. I lay there listening, but I did not hear anything else. Come morning, the whole incident seemed like nothing. The kind of thing you'd tell at a party. A bobcat and spooky old woods. I even wrote a little of it into the book, and I gave the sound to one of my characters, a boy lying awake in the mill town. Can't blame me. I turned everything into material I could. I should tell you about Errol here. The next part is when I started looking for an explanation about these things, and Errol was the one who took my explanation away from me. I had met him at the hardware and everything store in town, where I went for stove pellets and bug spray, small things that you run out of. Errol Sockabasin. He was about 35 and built like a horse. The man worked with his hands, and he was Passamaquoddy. The Passamaquoddy are the native people of that whole coast. People of the Dawn is what the name means, and their communities are up the bay a ways, at Sipayik, near Eastport, and over at Indian Township. But Errol worked all around down there, and he'd done some of the work on Wendell's camps. When Wendell introduced us at the store, the two of them ribbed each other like men who had known each other a long time. Errol and I got to talking a couple of times after that, once for the better part of an hour over coffee at the gas station that had a few stools, and I liked him a great deal. He was funny and blunt. He read more than most people I'd taught with. I went down to the other house in my 3rd week, on a clear afternoon, when Wendell had said you could go anywhere. I told myself I was only stretching my legs. That isn't the whole truth. I was curious. From the road, it had looked like any summer place closed up for the winter, shutters across the front, but the grass was grown clear to the sill, and there was no path worn anywhere. The nearer I got, the more it felt like a place nobody had opened in years. Around the back, on the side that faced the trees, a storm window had been lifted off its clips and set down in the long grass. The sash behind it was unlatched. I got it up and climbed through. Nearly broke a leg, though, to be honest. I was too old then and too old now to be climbing through things like that. It took my eyes a minute to come right. Every window in the place had been covered from the inside, with newspaper mostly, and flattened cardboard where the newspaper had apparently run out, taped over each pane so the room stood in a brown underwater darkness. Whoever had stayed there started at the back of the house, the wooded side, and worked forward, as the back rooms were papered tight and careful, and the front ones were only half done, as though the work had been broken off and never taken up again. In the back bedroom, the mattress had been dragged off its frame and pushed into the corner farthest from the glass, and there was a nest of old blankets gone stiff in it. The inside of the door had a kitchen chair wedged up underneath the knob. The newspaper taped over the back window was 4 years old. I set the storm window back the way I'd found it, and I climbed out, careful with my old stiff legs, and I didn't tell anyone I'd been in there. The voices got worse over the next week and a half, and they changed. The crying came back twice, but then one night, late, I heard a woman's voice out in the trees, and she did not sound like she was crying. Instead, she was calling, 2 long notes, with an up and down to it, like, "Hello? Hello?" Except not a word, just noise. A few nights after that, I was lying in bed, and I heard it call again. This time I could swear it was closer, in toward the dooryard. And this time I was certain it had said a name. It called a name with the same 2-note syllable structure. And that name, or what my half-asleep brain had heard, was my name. I'm not going to pretend it said my name clearly. It was warped and far away sounding, but I'm pretty sure it was. I lay there with my heart going, and I did not answer it, though I do want to say the reptilian part of my brain wanted to answer back. Mo was on the floor by the bed. He had pressed himself flat against the bed frame, and he was trembling. I put my hand down and I felt him shaking. That was the first night the rationalizing got hard, because a bobcat cannot call a person's name. I lay awake until the light came. Then I made coffee and got online. The signal, again, was the problem I keep coming back to. There was no internet at the camp. To look anything up, I had to drive out to the town library, which was open 3 days a week, or sit in the parking lot of the store, using their Wi-Fi from my truck, which is what I did, hunching over my phone in the cab with the engine running for the heat. Sitting in a cold truck in a parking lot in a town at the end of the world, typing your symptoms into a search bar. That's how it goes now, isn't it? We don't go to the wise woman in the village. We go to the parking lot and for a search bar. Anyway, I typed in things like animal that sounds like a person in the woods. I got bobcats and foxes, gray foxes and barred owls, and I listened to recordings of all of them on my phone, holding it up to my ear. None of them were that. The fox was close. The fox scream is genuinely horrible and human. But the fox doesn't make that 2-note shape of a name, over and over, getting nearer. So I typed in other things. I typed in thing in the woods, imitating human voice. And that's where it found me. Or where I found it. The whole tangled mass of it. Videos and forum posts, and long anonymous accounts that read more or less exactly like the thing you're reading right now. I'd heard the word Skinwalker before, vaguely. I went down that rabbit hole that morning in the truck, and over the next several days at the library. I'll spare you most of what I've read. A lot of it was junk, and some of it I now think was dangerous in ways I didn't understand just yet. But the entire situation simply matched. A creature that could take the form of an animal, but not quite right. One that came around houses at the edge of woods after dark, and could make the sounds of animals and then the sounds of people. And it learned voices, learned to use them. It could call your name to draw you out past your door and into the trees. For whatever reason, it could not or would not come straight to you. It seemed to have to make you come to it, make you leave your shelter. And there was a rule that was repeated in every story about it that I heard. Never, ever answer. You should never even say its name either. There were more symptoms, I should say. Eyes that reflected the light at just the wrong height off the ground. A smell. I read all of it crouched over my phone, and a cold certainly settled into me, but at least I had a name for it. I drove back to the camp at the end of one of those library days, saying the word out loud in the cab, telling myself that's what it was, that there was a skinwalker in the woods behind the camp. I told Errol my theory 3 days later. We were at the gas station on those stools again, and I'd been working up to it. Finally, I just said that I wanted to ask him something that was going to sound insane. And I told him about the dog and the cries and the voice that had definitely called my name. Then I said the word of the creature, that I thought it might be a skinwalker. Errol had been drinking his coffee, nodding as he listened, until I said skinwalker. That's when his eyes went wide. He didn't laugh. I think part of me wanted him to just laugh at me, because I know I sounded ridiculous. But he did not. He then said carefully, looking at me, "I'd quit saying that word if I were you." "Why's that?" I asked. "That's not a word from here," he said. "That's a Navajo thing. Dene. That's the other side of the country. That's desert. That's a whole different people with a whole different language, and their own things they don't talk about. And they especially don't talk about that. People like you and me got no business borrowing it because we saw it in some video." He wasn't angry exactly, but there was an edge to his voice. It almost sounded like this wasn't his first time around with this sort of thing. Folks come up here, or they go out there, wherever, and something scares them in the woods, and the only word they've got for it is the one they took off the internet from somebody else's grandmother. And it's the wrong word. It's not yours, and it's not mine. And it sure as hell isn't from these woods. I asked him then a question. What was it then, if it wasn't that? I asked him, was there something here? Whether the people of this place had a name for this thing, the thing I was describing. He said, "I'm not going to sit in a gas station and give you a word to look up, so you can do the same thing with our word. But I will tell you this. These words are old, older than anybody. There are stories my grandmother had that I won't repeat to you, partly because they're not mine to hand out, and partly because I think handing them out is some of how this stuff gets going. People repeating things they don't understand. But I will tell you the part that's just common sense. You don't need to be from here to follow this." He leaned in closer. "If something out there has started to call you, do not answer it, and do not go to it. Don't even try to get a look at it. And you for damn sure do not stand out in your yard at night, having a nice loud conversation where it can hear you and learn how you sound. These things, whatever you want to call them, they are listening. That's the whole thing they do. They listen, and they learn, and they use it. The less it's heard of you, the less it has to use. If Errol was right, I'd already broken the one rule that mattered most without knowing it was a rule. I would not understand how badly until it was nearly too late. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I drove home from that conversation, rattled, especially because of how Errol had looked at me. Like I had done something shameful, reaching for a word that wasn't mine. And I made a decision, sitting in that truck, that I think probably saved my life, though I came to it for the wrong reasons. I decided to stop using that word, even in my own head. I decided I didn't get to name it, and I started that night to keep the doors locked, the curtains pulled, and I would not go outside after dark, never answering it. What I did not stop doing, because it did not occur to me that the calls counted, because the calls were to my daughter, and they were the happiest and safest feeling things in my life. But what I did not stop doing were those walks down toward the cove every evening at dusk, calling Rachel, standing there in the open with my voice carrying out over the water and back into the trees, saying her name, saying I love you, and hanging up. I did so for another week and a half. Things at the camp got worse fast after the gas station. First, there was a smell. 2 evenings after I talked to Errol, I opened the back door to let Mo out for his last business of the night, and it rolled in at me out of the dark. A low and thick sweet rot. The smell of a deer that's been dead in a ditch. But worse. Maybe it's only worse because I knew it was coming from something terrible. That smell, though, it was something that made the back of my throat close up on its own. Mo would not go out into it. I shut the door quickly, and the smell dissipated, just like that. The rest of the night, the camp was full of the wood stove and nothing else. But I'd had it in my nose, and I noticed the smell had come from up high and close, from right outside the door at about the height of my own face, not down low where a dead animal in the leaves would be. Then there was the one time I saw it. It was at dusk, the end of a nice afternoon. I was at the kitchen window doing dishes, not really thinking about any of it. I looked up across the cleared ground at the tree line, and there was a shape standing just inside the trees. I took it for a deer at first, the size and the color of a deer in that light. Then I understood that it was standing upright, taller than a man. Its head was up near the low spruce boughs, and that the 2 points of light I could see, where its face should be, were catching the last of the daylight, like an animal's reflective eyes. Except they were a good 7 feet off the ground, up where no deer's eyes were, and where no man's eyes usually were. It and I did not move. I stood at the sink with a plate dripping in my hand, and we looked at each other across the dooryard for about 5 seconds. It was then that a car went by, out from the main road, a half-mile off, but close enough to be loud. I glanced momentarily at the sound, less than a heartbeat, and when I looked back, the tree line was empty. It was just a normal tree line. Dark spruce going to black, nothing standing in it at all. I've never been able to decide which is worse, that it was there at all, or how completely it wasn't there the instant I looked away. Like seeing a spider in your bedroom, blinking and it's gone, wondering if it ran away, or if it somehow made it under your bed sheets. The knocking started a few nights after that. I was in bed with the lights off, and there came 3 knocks in the wall of the camp. Not the door, but the back wall, which faced the trees. This sounded exactly like knuckles on wood. 3 knocks and a pause and 3 more. I lay rigid, and the thing I noticed is that the knocks were very high up. They came from up near the top of the wall, near where the wall met the ceiling. 8 feet off the ground, if not higher. Nothing standing on the ground outside a one-story camp knocks at 8 feet. I told myself it had to be a branch. But there was no tree close enough to that wall to be a branch, and I knew it. The knocking came in those threes, with the long pause between, 4 or 5 times, and then it stopped. During it, poor old Mo had crawled under the bed, all the way under, pressing himself against the far wall. And I tried to get him out, but he refused. So I just lay there until light, with a scared dog under my bed. In the morning, I went outside. After all, in the morning, you think you'll find an explanation to things like this. Around the back of the camp, in the soft ground at the edge of the trees, I found tracks. Now, I'm a Massachusetts suburb man. I'm not going to oversell my tracking skills here. But I've seen deer tracks my whole life, and these started as deer tracks. I was sure of it. The 2-lobed split prints coming out of the trees toward the camp. But then, about 10 feet from my wall, they changed. I crouched down over the place where they changed, and my mouth went dry. The split deer print stretched and opened over the course of 3 or 4 steps into something longer and flatter, and the last clear print before the ground went hard near the wall was not a hoof, and it was not a paw. It was long, and it had toes. 2 mini toes, and too long, splayed out, pressed deep at the front, like something had come down hard on the ball of a foot. I'm not going to tell you it was a perfect handprint or footprint, because it wasn't. It was its own disturbing thing. It was closer, though, to a foot than to anything that should be walking in the Maine woods, and the deer tracks turned into it as smooth as a sentence. That was the morning I should have left. I did consider it. I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee and the door locked in broad daylight, thinking you could pack the truck in an hour and be in Bangor by lunch. But I didn't leave. I mean, the book was going well, and I had it in my head that this was the price of ending the book the right way, that real writers went somewhere hard and stayed and endured it. And even now, I didn't fully believe that a Skinwalker-like thing was haunting me. Not in the daylight, for sure. There was, underneath, a small ugly thread of not wanting to believe what was happening. Being more interested, in fact, than afraid. I'm a person who'd wanted his whole life for something to happen to him, and a deep, stupid part of me did not want to drive away from the one strange thing that had ever come to my door. I'm not proud of feeling that way, but that's how I felt. I called Rachel that evening down by the cove. She could hear it in my voice. She said to me, "Dad, you sound terrible. Sounds like you haven't slept." I told her I hadn't been sleeping great. The camp made noises at night, I said. It's an old building, and there's lots of wind. I told her I'd been working hard on my book. "What kind of noises have you been hearing?" she asked. She has a way of knowing when something's actually wrong, even if you try to pretend there's not something wrong. And she's very direct when she notices that. And I could hear from her voice that that's what was happening. She had noticed. "Dad, you sound scared. You don't sound like you. Is somebody bothering you up there? Is it safe? I don't like you being out at the end of some road by yourself with no phone reception." I said I was fine. It's an old man's nerves in an old camp, and I had a trusty old dog by my side. I made my voice light as I said it. I didn't want her to worry anymore. I stood there out in the open by the water, saying all of this out loud. Her name, the reassurances. And I'll never know for sure, but I've come to believe it was very close to this call. Probably in the trees behind me, listening to me say, "Rachel." And somehow listening to her voice through the phone, which wasn't even on speaker. Learning the both of us. I told her I loved her, and she told me to call her every single day or she was going to drive up here. I laughed and said, okay, and we hung up. She called the next 2 days, and I kept it together on the phone. On the third day, I didn't pick up. I was at the library, and the signal there had dropped. That was the day she decided. She texted me that she was coming up that weekend and that there would be no arguments. I argued, though, by text, weekly, but she didn't answer. Instead, she showed up. I've thought a great deal about whether I should have tried to stop her, or tried to lie better. Maybe I should have told her I was coming home, so she wouldn't try to drive up here into this. At the time, I was, God help me, relieved to have company. I wanted someone else to be here. I wanted somebody else to hear it, so I would know I wasn't losing my mind, which is the most selfish wish I've ever had. But it came true, and I would have to live with it. Rachel got to the camp Friday afternoon, while it was still light out. She had driven 3.5 hours, and she came in tired and worried, trying not to show the worried part. She hugged me tightly, but then held me at arm's length, looking at my face. I saw her clock how I looked. I'd lost weight. I hadn't slept more than a couple of hours a night in over a week. She'd brought groceries, real food, and a bottle of wine. She made a point of being cheerful. Then she got the wood stove going, making fun of the camp's decor, and Mo was glad to have her. He stuck to her side, and for a few hours that Friday evening, it was almost wonderful. The two of us at the table eating a real dinner she had cooked. The lamp was on and the stove was warm, with the dog under the table. I almost convinced myself it would behave with her around. Maybe it only came for a person alone. But it came that night. We'd gone to bed late, both of us, her in the little second bedroom and me in mine, and I'd laid in there listening the way I did, and around 2 a.m, it began to call. It called from out in the dooryard, close, closer than it had ever come, right out front this time instead of the back, and it called a name again in that 2-note way. But the name this time around was Rachel. Then it called again, and the second time it was much more clear, clearer than any night before, and clear enough that the bottom dropped out of my own stomach, because it was no longer that warped, far-off voice anymore. It had a voice now, a voice calling my daughter's name. Rachel, and a man's voice, a voice that was trying to be, and very nearly was, my voice. I then heard Rachel's door open down the hall. I came out of my room. She was standing in the dark of the little hallway in her sweatshirt. I could see in the dim light from the windows that her eyes were huge. "Dad," she whispered. "Dad, is somebody out there? Somebody just said my name. Somebody outside just said my name." Her voice was shaking. "I swear, it sounded like..." She stopped. Then she looked at me, and I watched her not be able to finish that sentence. I know what she was going to say. It had sounded like it was me, but there I was standing right in front of her, and her mind was refusing to accept that possibility. I put my finger to my lips. I took her hand, and we went together into the main room, going low and away from the windows. We crouched down by the wood stove with our backs to the warm iron, and Mo came, shoving himself in between us. He was shaking so hard I could hear his tags, and we stayed there. That thing outside, it kept calling Rachel's name. Eventually it called my name too, in my own voice. And then it called both. It said out in the dooryard in the dark, in a voice that was my voice gone slightly wrong, "Rachel, Rachel, honey, come out here. I just need a hand with the truck." Rachel made a sound against my shoulder. I had her hand in both of mine, and I gripped it as hard as I could. I shook my head at her. No, no, and she nodded, fast. She understood. She wasn't going anywhere. But the tears were running down her face. That thing in the dooryard had her father's voice and was asking her to come outside. There's no part of a person that is built to sit still and not answer that, or not react. It went on for what the clock later told me was nearly 40 minutes, and felt like the whole rest of my life. It said my name in her voice, calling me. Dad? Dad, come help me. It said her name in my voice. It got my little verbal habits, the way I say honey to her, the way I'd said I love you, kiddo, at the end of every one of those calls down by the cove. It fed all of it back to us, out from the dark. Rearranged, almost right. The most obscene thing I've ever heard. Two voices that loved each other so much in the world, coming out of a single mouth in the dooryard, taking turns, asking each of us to come outside to the other one. Here's what broke me. What made me finally understand all the way down what it was and where it had gotten its material. At one point, it said in my voice the exact phrase I'd said to Rachel on the phone 3 or 4 evenings before, standing down by the cove. I'd said, "I'm fine, kiddo. It's just an old man's nerves and an old camp." Word for word. It said it back into the dark in my voice, my exact sentence, the one I'd spoken out loud into the open air with the trees at my back. I knew, fully and finally then, it had been there for every call. It had stood in the spruce only a few feet away, listening to me hand it my own daughter's voice and my own, night after night. That the role Errol had given me at the gas station, the only role that mattered. Don't let it hear you. I'd been breaking it every single evening since before I'd even met him. Around the time the sky started going from black to the first nudges of light, it finally stopped. But we stayed put for a while. We sat right by the wood stove, holding the dog and each other, until the light in the windows was true and real light, full dawn, and the foghorn out at Quaddy was going. 2 blasts every 30 seconds. Such a comforting sound then. Only at that moment did I get up, my legs barely working. I went to the front window, and I looked out at the dooryard. There was frost on the ground. The first hard frost of the year had come in the night. And in the frost, in the bare dirt of the dooryard, all around in front of the door where it had stood and called us, were the tracks, those long, splayed, not quite footprints. Dozens of them, layered over each other in a churned mess like something had stood there, shifting its weight for a long time. They came out of the tree line, then they went back into the tree line, and that was the only direction they came from and went to. I stood there and looked at them in the daylight with my daughter behind me. I've never been in my life so glad to be cold and tired but alive. We left within the hour. We threw things in the truck, no plan to be had. Rachel was past arguing about whether it was real. She'd heard it. She'd heard her own father's voice coming out from the darkness, wanting her to walk into the trees. There's no library video for that. There's no rational frame for that. She kept saying, we're going, just get in the truck, Dad." I got the dog and my bag of clothes, and I'm ashamed to say my laptop with the book on it, the one thing I made sure of, and we left almost everything else. The food, the still warm wood stove, the curtains open. I called Wendell from the cove on our way out, hands shaking bad. I could barely hold the phone up. I couldn't even tell if I was making sense as I talked to Wendell. I told him we were leaving, that someone had been at the camp. I apologized. I told him I'd pay the rest of the rent and then some to be safe. But old Wendell, he didn't ask what happened. He said slowly, "All right, I understand. Please drop Mo off when you can on your way, but then go on home. You and your girl go right on home after that." Then he said one more thing. "It never bothered me to lose the renters that left too fast. It's the ones that wanted to stay and have a look that I was always worried about." He hung up. We met up with him. I gave him Mo, who was still shaking, the poor guy, and Wendell wished us a safe drive. We left. Rachel was in her own vehicle. We drove south all that day. Rachel followed me partway and then peeled off for Portland once I'd convinced her I was steady enough to make the rest. I got back to my too large, too empty house in central Massachusetts that night, and I locked every door. I didn't bother to sleep. I've not been back to Maine, and I have not, despite a year of telling myself I should, finished the book. But it found me. I kept the habits I came home with, locking the doors at dusk, all of them, the front and the back and the bulkhead down to the cellar, and I pulled the curtains. I left a lamp burning in the kitchen, and I didn't sleep much. At night, I sat up in the kitchen with the lamp and a book that I wasn't actually reading. This is what I was doing, a little after 1 in the morning, when I heard a dog. It was at the back door, on the steps. The sound of a dog desperately wanting out of the cold. It sounded like a paw scratching at the storm door, then a high, thin whine broken off short, followed by another scratch. I knew that sound, as I'd heard it plenty back at the camp. Mo at the door after his last business of the night, wanting back in to be by the wood stove. With a worried smile, I was up and across the kitchen with my hand on the deadbolt, before I'd thought anything at all. It was only with my fingers on the bolt that the rest of me caught up and stopped. Mo was in Maine. Mo should be hundreds of miles north in Lubec with Wendell, where I'd left him. An old dog who needed a hand under him to climb into the bed of a truck. There's no version of this world where he would come down to stand on my back steps in the middle of the night. I took my now trembling hand off the bolt. There's a small window in the back door, 4 little panes, and I stood to the side and I peered out. There was a dog on the steps. The porch light was off, but the frost threw back what came off the street lamp at the end of the drive, and I could plainly see him. A black dog gone gray at the muzzle, sitting on the top step with his head turned up toward the door. That was Mo. It was definitely Mo. Down to the white at his chin, with one ear being floppier than the other. When he saw my face at the glass, his tail moved. Once, then twice, then swiping back and forth, clearing an arc of frost on the boards. The whine came again, happy sounding this time, the sound he made for a person he knew and liked. Every part of me wanted to go toward the deadbolt again. He was an old dog, out in the cold. He'd come all that way, and I loved that dog more than I'd let myself say. My hand was halfway up before I made myself hold still and only look. Then I observed. I first noticed that he did not fog. It was cold enough that my own breath in the house fogged a bit. And the dog was breathing. I could see his sides go in and out, but nothing came out of him into the air. The second thing was the stillness under the wagging. A held stillness, rather than the tail being part of a dog's body. It was like a hand under a suit, remembering to wag the tail appendage to keep up the disguise. And the third thing, which made my legs wobble, was that as he looked up at me, his eyes caught that thin light and threw it back. 2 flat green coins, but they weren't on his face. They were a foot in the air, higher than the dog itself. A dog sitting on a step has its eyes a foot off the boards, eyes not connected to the body. That made no sense. That's when a smell began to come in from under the door, reminding me immediately of that dark night. That thick, sweet rot, with something worse folded up in it. It spewed forth into my own kitchen, forcing my throat to seal off against it. Suddenly, the dog opened his mouth. What came out of it was not a bark. It started as a whine, the happy one, but then it began to bend, became more distant, and under the dog's voice, there came another, and I swear to you now, it sounded like Wendell. It was the old man's voice, and it said to me through that door, "Let him in. He's cold." I did not open that door. I stepped back into the middle of the kitchen where the lamp was, and I watched that dog stand up. He put his front paws on the storm door, except standing now, he was taller than the dog should have been. His paws were up where a man's hands would be, and his eyes were level now with the window, his real eyes, level with mine from across the kitchen. He did not look like a dog up on its hind legs. He looked like something folded down into the shape of a dog that had grown bored with holding it in. Then he waited. He didn't bark, scratch, or call. He stood at the door with those green eyes on me, patient and certain. And I waited too in the lamplight, neither of us moving. The clock on the stove went from 1 to 2, and from 2 to 3. I do not know the hour it left. At some point, I noticed the eyes were no longer at the window, that there was nothing in the 4 panes but the dark and the dim shape of my own face, and I did not go and look. I sat at the table with my back to the wall, staying there with the lamp on until sunup, and I waited an hour after that before deciding to open the back door. The steps were empty. The frost lay unbroken over the yard except on the steps themselves, scuffed and churned to nothing on the top board, where the thing had stood and waited for me. Out past the bottom step on the white of the lawn were the tracks, and I think we both know the story by now. They began as a dog's. At the foot of the steps they were neat and round, the prints of a dog that had trotted up and sat there. They led away toward the back of the lot, and about 10 feet out, they changed. They stretched, opened, over 3 or 4 steps, into the long splayed prints with too many toes. The same ones I'd crouched over behind the camp, except instead of a deer, it was a dog's, the malformation of a dog. They crossed the lawn in that shape and went into the trees at the back of my lot. There's a line of trees behind the fence at the back there. Town trees. A strip of oak and maple, 50 feet of it, no more. And on the far side is my neighbor's. Their yard, the road, no more woods. There are no woods within 20 miles of my house besides that. The prints came out of those trees, and they went back into them. Do you think skinwalkers were like the beta version of AI, using campers and hikers' voices as training data until they got the voice just right? But instead of making funny memes where Morgan Freeman's voice tells you not to go number 2 in a urinal, they just lure you outside and drag you into the woods. Good night. Thanks so much for listening to Unexplained Encounters. I've been your host, Darkness Prevails. Have some scary stories of your own? Send them to us at darkstories.org. By the way, if you need more scary story narrations from me, I read scary work-related stories on my other show, Tales from the Break Room. which you can find right now on Apple Podcasts and Spotify or your favorite podcast app. Just look for Tales from the Break Room. Thank you. Till next time, everyone, stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.